Okay, this session is Success with Macro Photography with Gene Barlow. For many of you in the user group community, you've known Gene for many years doing his presentations of Acronis backup software, but today he's going to talk to us about photography, and I am going to give him the floor right now. And he now has a microphone. And are you there, Gene?
I am here. Thank you very much for everyone attending. I read down through the list, and wow, we've got the who's who of the user group community attending. I appreciate all of you coming to this session. This is a little different, as Huey mentioned, for me. I am not going to talk about a product that I represent, but instead I'm going to talk about a hobby of mine. I've been an avid photographer since about the age of 15 and have done all sorts of different types of photography. The last many years I've specialized in macro and close-up photography, and so I thought I would talk about that because that's a topic I know most about. And so we will get started, and let me get used to the changing. Here we go. Macro photography is the process of photographing small things or details of large things. And it's always opens up a whole new perspective to people because they are not used to seeing very small things up close. And so there's a lot of interest in macro photography. And for example, here's a small bud of a pine cone that you can see the details of the bud. This thing is about the size of a dime, but by photographing it very up close, you see a lot of details that you probably weren't aware of before. On the other hand, here's a large item that is some bark on a tree that has sort of an interesting texture to it. So this is a small detail of a large item, a whole tree, that we've gone in close on just to show you some of this detail. And again, this is the process of macro or close-up photography. Now there is a difference. Macro photography is officially defined as giving a life-size image on the film or the sensor screen that you're using. So if I were to take a picture of this dime and then process it on some film, you could set that dime on top of the film and they'd be exactly the same size. So that's macro photography. And it actually extends beyond life size. It extends down to twice as big or 3 times as big. So that's macro photography. Close-up photography is anything less than life size. It may be half size or a quarter size. And so close-up photography is still quite interesting, but you just aren't quite as close to it. Now it depends on your subject. You may want to be in real close for certain subjects and back a little ways for other subjects. So there's no real importance one way or another. Today we actually measure this on the image on the sensor within your digital camera. And because each digital camera has a different size, the definition between macro and close-up is getting a little bit cloudy, and it's commonly used interchangeable. So don't fuss too much about it. Either one will work. Now here's an example of a close-up photograph. By the way, my wife and I took all of these pictures, or most of them. A couple of daisies we were in close enough to get both of them, and yet here's a picture of the same type of daisy, only in macro degree. You'll notice there's a small bead of water over here, as well as a lot more detail in the center portion of the daisy. So those are the two differences between those. Now there are several ways to get macro or close-up photography with your cameras. Now in most cases I'm going to be talking about digital cameras and single lens reflex digital cameras, because they are the most adaptable and you can change lenses and put on various filters and other things to them. So here are some of the ways. Probably the least expensive way and the easiest way to get to the area of close-up photography is to buy a set of close-up lenses. And they screw on to the front of your camera just like a filter would screw on. Now they come in different intensities. The +1 is the least intense, +2 and +3, and you can actually combine 2 or 3 of these together. If you wanted a +4, you'd combine a +1 and a +3. Just remember to stack the strongest lens, in other words the +3, nearest your camera lens. Now these are small, easy to carry around. You can get them, they're very inexpensive. If you get a very basic set, pay around $30 for it. But because it is a glass element between the subject and your camera, the sharper the lens, the better quality the picture you're going to be able to take. And so go for one that's a high quality close-up lens. You may pay $95 for a package of those. Otherwise you'll be degrading the quality of your picture. Now because there is no distance change in the lens and your film or your sensor, it doesn't reduce the light entering your camera, and so there's no light reduction concerns in this case. Alright, let's go on to the next one, which is zoom lens. And a lot of zoom lens today come with something called macro settings. They're really not macro settings, they're more close-up settings, but they work just as well. Because a zoom lens is not as sharp as a single focal length lens, the sharpness is a little less, but it's still very good quality. And also zoom lens, as you zoom them in and out, they slow down. The aperture changes, and so you may have a f4 aperture at the widest angle of the zoom lens, and it'll end up at f5.6 down at the lowest or the most telephoto lens. But zoom lenses are more practical because everyone has a zoom lens in their camera kit, and they're certainly less expensive than macro lenses. So that's probably the second way people get into macro photography. Just be aware, this is close-up photography even though it calls a macro setting. A third way to go is to add an extension tube between your lens and your camera. It's nothing more than just a hollow tube that allows you to attach one side of the tube to the camera and the other side of the tube to the lens. And in that case, the lens is removed a little further away from the camera. And the greater the distance between the lens and the camera, the more magnification or close-up capabilities does that lens take on. Now these come in a set, usually 12mm, 20mm, 36mm, and yes, you can stack one or more of them. They're fairly inexpensive, $20 typically, but you do lose the automatic focusing and auto exposure features of your lens if the extension tube does not pass those through. And so to get an extension tube that will pass through your lens auto focus and exposure, you're going to have to buy one from the camera manufacturer that matches your lens set. There's no glass in these, so it doesn't degrade in the sharpness, but because it does add distance between your lens and your camera, it does decrease the amount of light arriving on your sensor, and hence you're going to stop down a stop or two if you run one of these, but it'll give you a lot more close-up capability. Now, a bellows is a special type of an extension tube. Bellows, you attach your camera to one end, you attach your lens to the other end, and you can adjust the bellows so the distance between the lens and the camera varies. And this gives you some really fine tuning of your close-ups. They're much more expensive, and the longer the bellows distance you use, the less light you're going to have reaching your sensor on your camera. So that's another approach. All right, a third one is sort of like an extension tube, only it has glass in the middle, and these are called teleextenders. These teleextender tubes we add between your lens and your camera, and they usually come in a couple of sizes. There's a 1-time magnification and a 2-time magnification. And the more expensive ones, they are more expensive than extension tubes because they have a lens element in them, glass in them. Again, buy the highest quality extension tube you can. Teleextender you can, because of the quality of the lens in the extender. Sharpness will be degraded because of the extra glass, and yes, you will lose loss of light because of the distance put between your camera and your lens. And in most cases, you're going to lose your autofocus, auto exposure features of your lens. But you can get quite close up with teleextenders. Some companies will put out a zoom short telephoto lens and a teleextender to go with it, which doubles the speed or the magnification of that lens. And they are matched and would make an excellent excellent setup for doing close-up photography. All right, our next option, and this is one you may never think about, is a reversing ring. On one side of this ring, there is a connector that connects to the filter element of your lens. On the other side is a connector to the body of your camera. And so you actually mount your camera on backwards. Mount your lens on backwards to your camera. Now, if you think about it, if you've got a wide angle lens, it takes a lot of information and condenses it down to a small image. But if you reverse it, the opposite is the effect. It takes a small image and magnifies it to a much larger image on your sensing device. And so it causes a great deal of magnification. And reversing lens is almost always macro, giving you life size or more. Because the reversing lens has no glass in it, it produces a very sharp image. And there's no loss of light because this reversing lens does not really add a lot of extension between the lens and the camera. And extremely low cost, probably in the $20 range. But yes, you do lose your autofocus and auto exposure that come with your lens. So you're going to have to, in a reversing lens situation, you're going to have to set those and then stop down your lens and focus it all before you take the actual pictures, because none of the automatic features will go through. All right, then there's my favorite of the bunch, and that's a macro lens. It's a single speed lens. They usually come in a couple of sizes. You can buy normal macro lenses that are in the 50 millimeter range, or short telephoto lenses in the 100 millimeter lens length. They are specifically designed for macro photography, and so they are excellent optics in these lenses. They're very, very sharp. Because it is a single focus lens, you're apt to have a much faster lens than, say, a zoom lens. So getting one that's in the f2 or f3.5 range is common. Autofocus, auto exposure of your lens is maintained because the connection between these is not broken. But just be aware you could spend $300-400 for the smaller, the normal macro lens, and the short telephoto macro lenses could be in the $500-700 range. But if you're going to do a lot of close-up and macro photography, this is the way to go. Now, these lenses normally focus from the close-up range all the way down to and including life size or macro. And so they are truly macro lenses, but they typically don't go down double macro, 2 times life size, 3 times life size. To do that, you're going to probably need a reversing lens, a reversing ring. Okay, now we've talked about the basic ways, but you can take combinations of these and come up with some very interesting ways to shoot close-up photography. For instance, a reversing ring on a bellows gives you super high macro capability. Here's an example of it shown below. And if you want to get down 3 or 4 times life size, dig down really to maybe the eye of a fly or something like that, well, then this is the combination you're going to want to do. Now you've got other combinations. You could put a telephoto, a zoom lens with a macro setting, and a tele-extender on it, or even a lens on the front, a close-up lens on the front. And so try different combinations of these, and you may see some interesting results. I still much prefer the simplicity of the macro lens, so that's what I've been using the last few years. By the way, a macro lens makes an ideal primary lens for your camera. It takes great distance shots and portrait shots and other things. So if you want to watch the expense of your camera system, you may get a macro lens instead of a standard close-up, regular 50 millimeter standard distance lens, or even in place of a short telephoto lens. Depth of field, we've got some issues that we need to consider. The first one, and probably the most important, is depth of field. Now, if I'm standing on a bluff looking over a valley and I see mountains in the distance, that entire bluff, that entire scene is probably in focus. And so general landscapes, you may have miles of depth of focus. In other words, the mountains in the far background as well as the tree that's up a few feet away from you all are in focus. But when you get in very close doing macro photography or close-up photography, you may only have 1/4 of an inch in focus. So in this picture you see that the center part of the flower, the stamen here, is all closely in focus, as well as the flower at that same distance, the petal at that same distance. But notice this foreground petal and the background petal of that same flower are out of focus. The depth of field you're working with in macro is just a very, very short one. Now, in order to get the largest depth of field, you need to increase the aperture to a very small aperture. F16, F22, some cameras may have F32. I don't know if you remember, many years ago there was a group of 7 photographers that called themselves the F64 group. Ansel Adams, White, and some others were in this group of photographers. And they believed in the concept of having everything in the picture in focus. And so F64 was their way of expressing that. Now, of course, when you reduce the aperture to a very small aperture, that's going to significantly reduce the amount of light on your sensor. And with digital cameras, you're going to have to increase your shutter speed or increase your ASA rating for the camera, which may bring in noise into the digital photograph. And I like to leave my ASA closer to 100 or 200, so shutter speed is the thing that I usually end up reducing. Now, having a short shutter speed also, well, here's a couple examples. Here's a photograph we took in Hawaii a couple of years ago. This dark pink flower and its stamen were all at about the same distance from the camera, and so most of that is in focus. However, this white or light pink flower was about 2 inches closer to the camera than the dark pink, and hence it's all out of focus. The background has the leaves in the background are a little bit in focus here and here, so I perhaps should have focused this a little closer to this front flower and less on the second flower, and I might have gotten both of them in focus at that point. In another example, here's a collection of flowers that we took that I wanted to emphasize the bright golden flowers, and hence I focused on this center one. Now, it was all of these golden flowers were sort of in the background compared to this blue stock flower in the foreground. So you can see that that's out of focus, as well as another part of it over here. And the background is also out of focus. So I've got a fairly large depth of field. This was not true macro, this was close-up. And the close-up photography has a larger depth of field. Now, I've got a professional photographer friend that tells me never have anything in the foreground out of focus. And so he wouldn't like this picture. But personally, I don't mind the out of focus foreground. So it's something that you may want to consider. Here's a picture my wife took of the same blue stock. This time she focused on the foreground, and her flowers in the background are out of focus. And it works just as well this way, just depending on what you want to make as your main subject in the photograph. Now, slow shutter speed, because of your very small apertures and extension tubes, if you use them, could put your shutter speed down to a quarter of a second, half a second, or a second. And of course you're beyond the handheld region if you go down that low. So you're going to have to think of using a tripod or some other means to steady the camera so you can take at these slow speeds and very small apertures. Another problem that you run into with the slow speeds is moving subjects. Now, if you go up into the mountains and take photographs of wildflowers, the wind can be blowing those flowers back and forth in front of your camera lens. And so even if you have the camera sitting on a tripod, that flower is moving in front of your lens. And the only way around this that I have found is to go early in the morning when there is less wind. And that way you usually can find a slow point in the wind where you can take close-up photographs. Another concern is if you're photographing insects, butterflies and bees, they move. And to follow them around and get a picture of butterflies and bees is another challenge with a slow shutter speed. So a couple of more concerns about the slow shutter speeds. Here's a picture my wife took. She had 2 bees on one flower. Fortunately, this was a close-up and not a macro photograph. So she is standing back some distance, and her depth of field is better, and hence she can raise. It was a bright sunny day, and she raised her shutter speed enough to hand hold this one. But the real solution is to get yourself a solid tripod. Now, tripods come in with a variety of features, and what you need, most flowers, wildflowers, are very low to the ground, and so you need a tripod that can get you very close to the ground. They have little miniature tripods. I find them a little unstable, and I prefer a full-size tripod, or at least a small full-size tripod. But what you want to look for is the lens that have a setting that they can spread spread those legs out till they're almost going out perpendicular from the camera. This way you can set the tripod very, very close to the ground. Now the other concern is this center post. Center posts need to have the ability to remove them. And the tripod that I got, you removed it from this point on so that when you did spread out the legs, it would physically go close to the ground. And if you are using a tripod to cover some very slow shutter speeds, make sure you use a cable release so that it won't jiggle the camera while you're pressing on the release button. So that's the tripod you need to consider. Another consideration to handle the speed problem is a macro flash solution. This way you would provide a burst of light to these up-close subjects such that you can handle a faster speed lens and still stop down your aperture to a small aperture. And so if you're shooting insects, it will freeze the motion of the wings and any movement the insect has on the flower. And there are 2 or 3 ways to get a macro flash. Probably the most popular is something called a ring flash. It is a circular flash unit that mounts on the front edge of a macro lens, or whatever lens you're using. And hence you've got a flash burst of light that comes from around the lens. Now I find this gives a very flat front lighted version, and I don't find that quite as nice as another option, and that is to have multiple flashes, 2 perhaps, on each side of the lens, and then you can adjust the intensity of one of these flashes down so that you can get some modeling in your picture with a very bright light coming from one side and a dimmer fill light coming from the other side. And I actually don't use a ring mounted flash system, but I have a bracket that that fits under my camera and 2 arms on this bracket with a flash unit mounted at the end of each arms, so that I can put these bracketed arms out at the side of whatever subject I'm photographing. And of course, by adjusting the intensity on the flash, I can adjust the modeling, which is the primary flash, which is the fill flash. Synchronization is a concern if you're working with something like this, making sure it synchronizes to give you the best exposure with your camera. Okay. Another interesting concern when you take pictures is to watch for the direction of the natural sunlight. If you can get a backlit flower, it gives a very translucent picture, and it actually becomes very interesting and bright and colorful. Side lighting tends to emphasize the shape of the subject you're photographing, and if you've got front lighting, it will give you some very close details, but you lose the shape a little bit and you don't see the translucent effect. Here's a let's see, I guess here's a picture of a backlit flower that we took, and notice the petals that are in the sun backlit, how they glow and stand out. Even some of these lower petals have little glimpses of that backlighting effect. The center turns out to be a dark shaded area, but I like the emphasis of the backlighting and how it makes everything look. Now here's a side lit flower. The light's coming in from the side. You can notice the shape of the flower very well, especially look at this center portion. With the side lighting, you'll notice there's an indentation in the middle of that centerpiece. It actually looks like a donut hole. It doesn't go all the way through, but it does indent in. And you wouldn't notice that if you had front lighting, for example. Here's that same flower front lit. You can just barely get the indication there is an indentation there. But the front lighting gives you excellent detail in the veins of the petals, and even in the center portion of the thing you see a great deal of detail. But you do lose a bit of the shape and the modeling of the shape. Another thing to look for in taking close-up photography is abstract patterns. Maybe one picture of a flower is okay, but maybe a whole field of flowers is more interesting. And if you can repeat certain shapes of the same flower and even repeat the color, it can be even a monotone color, a white or gray, still can give a very interesting picture. So here's a grassy white grass element that you took up close, so we aren't looking at any detail of it. It's just a pattern of this grassy element sort of bending over to the left. Here's another picture that I took that my daughter loves and has hanging in her home. These are just small flowers that are all clustered on a large stem, and by getting in close I get more of a pattern to this picture rather than an individual flower. And you can see the background is quite a bit out of focus, and but it makes just this pattern sort of stand out when you do that. Finally, here's another item. It's a sort of a set of leaves. It wasn't really a flower, but just getting in close on this and looking at the interesting pattern of this cluster of leaves, you can see some detail with the dew that is on those flowers, but it just makes sort of a pleasing pattern that you're looking at instead of any one little detail. Something else to look at. Now, when you're out taking pictures of wildflowers, you want to look around, choose a flower that's in good shape, isn't dying, doesn't have missing petals or whatever. Find a beautiful subject and then look at it from many different angles. Look at it from a high point of view, a low point of view, all different sides, front and back, close-ups and far away. And you may get a totally different picture from the same flower, taking it from different angles. Now, in our area, we have a lot of Indian paintbrush flowers. They're these bright red flowers that are all over our hillsides. And so I find them an interesting subject. Here's one I took with a couple of different colored flowers out of focus in the background, but they sort of add some contrast to this bright red color. Another approach is this one, where I'm focusing more in on an individual bloom of the Indian paintbrush. This is a fairly large flower, and I'm looking down on it, so the lower portions of this flower are out of focus, but you can see some focus in the upper reaches of the petals, and you'll notice the little hair elements that are extending out of the flower. Now, with the dark green background, this contrast here makes this flower stand out quite a bit. Here's another one, even in closer. This time I'm looking at that flower from the side instead of from the top like the last one, and so I see all elements of this flower mostly in focus. In the background you can see other Indian paintbrush blossoms that are out, but because they are in the background, they're out of focus and they add just color patches to the background. Finally, I got in very close to a flower, one of these Indian paintbrushes, and you see some very close detail of the inner workings of that flower. And so it gives a very surrealistic view of that flower. So look at a flower or a subject that you're taking, look at it from all angles, and take it from various angles. You may be surprised you like some angles better than others. Now, some other considerations, one to be very aware of is any foreground or background items. Make sure that the content is not distractive. Make sure that it's out of focus. Avoid blotches of bright light. You can use a black cardboard or a dark blue cardboard or a purple cardboard or something like that, dark green cardboard, to hold behind the flower to give a very simple background. Let's look at a couple of examples. Here's a very small cluster of flowers that I took with the macro lens. I'm in close. That whole cluster was about the size of a quarter. So this is a very, very small flower cluster. You can see the background is out of focus, which makes the flowers stand out and apart from the background. But there is a little bit of noise back here. The sticks and stems and things sort of distract the eye a little bit from this particular flower. My wife has a close-up camera, and here's one she took of the same flower. Actually, it was 3 blossoms of that same flower. But notice her background. It has nothing to distract, and in fact the black color make these white flowers really pop out at you. And all she did was hold a black cardboard behind the flower as she was taking it. And that cut out all of the distraction from the background and made the flower pop out like that. So think of that as a way to go, an option. Here's the same picture, same black cardboard that she stuck behind this picture of bright yellow flowers. Notice the background is purple in this case, because the bright yellow of all of the foreground, the flowers, shifted the color intensity so that the background became a purpley shade. Now I tried adjusting this flower, this picture, in Photoshop Elements, and I found when I turned that background into black again, that then the foreground, these flowers, became extremely yellow, to the extent that they were no longer interesting. And so I left the background a slight purple color, just so that the foreground would have a more pleasing color. And we've just got a few more examples that we put together for you as we reach the end of our presentation. We have cactus in the desert southwest, and this picture was a close-up of a cactus flower. These cactus flowers are very bright and colorful. And this one, you can see the actual cactus that it sets on. There's a bud over here at the side. And then notice all these needles slightly out of focus, but they add to the prickliness of this image. The next one, I used the close-up lens, and I went in closer on that main flower. And now you can see some detail down here in the center part of the flower that you couldn't see very well from the other one. And the whole picture becomes just of that one flower. Here's a photograph I took a couple of years ago of some bright colored daisies. One thing that I like in this photograph, this is a close-up, not a macro, is all three of these flowers are in focus. And I had to find three flowers that were at the same plane so that I could position my camera above them and have them all the same distance from the camera. If one of these flowers or two of them had been different depths from the camera, I would not have gotten this sharp picture. And of course, having the odd number of flowers, 3, makes it more interesting, and the rule of thirds, you'll notice, is also used here in the composition. The next photo of the same type of flower is what I would call a close-up versus a macro, a macro versus a close-up. Here the detail of the individual flower, even the dew petals on the flower, stand out, and you can see a lot more detail. But the other flowers in the picture are at different distances from the lens, and hence are out of focus. Here's a bud over here out of focus, and then these yellow petals back here are out of focus. Here are 3 more flowers, but notice in this case, this flower on the right is further away from the camera, hence it's out of focus, whereas the main flower on the left, lower left, is right in focus. And these buds, as well as this top flower, are closer to focus. So this is almost a pattern. You could consider it that way. It's an interesting cluster of flowers versus a individual flower. And using the close-up, you can go in very close, and here's one of those yellow daisy flowers. In this case, a fly was on it, and I was able to get in quite close, and fortunately that fly did not take off and fly away. Now, I use a standard focal length macro lens, and so I have to get the lens quite close to the flower in order to get close-ups. And in this case, that lens was probably an inch or two away from the fly. I'm surprised he stayed steady. The short telephoto macro lens, you can stand back 4 or 5 inches, 6 inches, and still get a close-up this good. But they are more expensive than I could afford, and so I opted for the less expensive option here. This picture my wife took. It's a close-up of a bird of paradise flower in Hawaii. The bright colors and all of the details, you can see the details in the plant and the flower, make it a very interesting picture, as well as the green leaves in the background, sort of out of focus, make it stand out a little bit. Here's another small yellow flower that was just coming out of bud. I guess these others were still in bud state. I'm not even sure where we took this. My wife took this photograph, but it gives you an interesting pinks and yellows. The colors are just fascinating, and all the background is sort of a misty green, a powdery green, and certainly out of focus, so none of it detracts from the main picture. I think this is the last one, and it's just a close-up of some plumeria flowers on Hawaii. Close up, you can even see a little ant in that petal. Not quite macro level. This is still close-up level, but gives you some interesting clustering of these two main blossoms on the intersection of the rule of thirds, so they're well positioned. At that, I think I am through with my presentation on macro photography. The part that I haven't talked about is protecting your photographs once you've taken them. And it would be a shame to have your hard drive crash and all of your digital photographs lost because you didn't back them up. And so let me just put in a plug here for our backup utility, True Image. You can go out to my website. Huey, you said you had my web address someplace.
I'm not sure, but we can include it. We can make sure that it's out there.
All right. Our web address is www.ugr.com. UGR stands for User Group Relations. That's my little company name. So www.ugr.com. I've got the best backup software on the market for you at half the retail price. And so go out there, you can order it for $25, and that along with a external hard drive to save your backups on is the best backup approach possible. I guess at this point we've got a few minutes left, and we can take questions.
Mm-hmm. And also, Jim Evans did put in your address in the box that they can grab at this point, copy and paste, or just save it.
Okay.
Do you see the questions down the left, or you want me to read them to you?
Yeah, I'll let you read them.
Okay, Ken Larrabee, let's see, there was one earlier comment, and it may have come off of here. What's your preferred macro lens?
I use a macro lens that is produced by the company who make my camera. In other words, I'm staying within the same camera system. I think that you get a good quality macro lens that way. Most Nikon and Canon, and I use Olympus. They make all good quality lenses to go with their cameras. Now Pentax and also makes macro lenses that will fit on an Olympus camera, and they make some very good lenses also.
Earlier during your presentation, Bill Dowd had put, you said short shutter speed. Don't you mean longer shutter speed, more light? And I'm not sure where that was, but I guess what he's asking is longer shutter speed does mean more light. Is that correct?
That's true. I get tongue-tied sometimes. Sorry about that.
We all do. Ken Larrabee asked, Photoshop can make infinite depth of field. Do you know if Elements has this capability?
Infinite depth of field. I'm just trying to think of how that is possible if that depth of field is not captured on the
multiple pictures he's
on
saying.
the film. Oh well, then that's high definition resolution, and I've got another presentation I could do on that one. That's another one of my specialty areas.
Okay.
But that is not depth of field. That's not a depth of field issue. That's a proper exposure issue. What HDR does was allows very bright subjects to be taken at a smaller aperture so that you can get more detail in those washed out parts of your picture, and likewise in the blacked out parts of the picture. So that's
Gene,
a whole other subject.
Gene, to add a plug for me, I do the digital virtual photo SIG, and you've joined us on that before. Excuse me. Perhaps we can get a conversation about this going at one of those as well. Ken usually attends those. Ken and Richard Allen said, thank you very much. Great presentation. We're actually over our time, so I need to end it. But Gene, thank you very much for a very, very interesting and some presentation, some gorgeous pictures. And with that note, I'm going to end the recording. If you want to say goodbye before I do, Gene.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. It's great to be with the group again. Thank you.
And we'll be doing the final session about user group fundraisers in just a moment.